The first American B-29 Superfortress appeared over Tokyo on November 1, 1944, flying at an altitude that made it look like a silver needle threading through scattered clouds. In the operations room of the Japanese Army Air Force headquarters, staff officers gathered around, plotting tables, watched the tracking reports come in with what one witness later described as professional curiosity rather than alarm. The massive four-engine bomber cruised at 32,000 feet, well above the effective ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. It dropped no bombs that day. It was a reconnaissance flight, a camera mission to photograph the Nakajima aircraft plants that sprawled across Musashino on Tokyo's western edge. Major General Kumazo Hattori, observing the plots, made a comment that would be recorded in several post-war accounts. The Americans had built an impressive machine, certainly, but sending individual bombers on photographic missions suggested they had very few of them. The general's assessment seemed reasonable at the time. Japan's intelligence services had tracked the B-29 program since 1942, and their reports consistently emphasized the aircraft's complexity, its cost, and the immense industrial challenge of producing such a machine in meaningful numbers. If the Americans possessed hundreds of these bombers, why send them one at a time? What General Hattori and his staff could not have known, what no amount of intelligence gathering could have revealed with certainty, was that on that same November day, 5,000 miles away in the Mariana Islands, construction crews were completing the final runway segments of 5 massive bomber bases. Northfield on Tinian Island alone would eventually accommodate 165 B-29 seconds, more heavy bombers than some entire air forces possessed. The concrete still curing under the Pacific sun represented an industrial commitment so vast that Japanese military planners, even if presented with accurate figures, would have struggled to accept them as credible. The Americans were not sending one bomber because they had few. They were sending one bomber because their hundreds had not yet arrived at their forward bases. The distinction would prove catastrophic. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Army Air Force in late 1944 operated under a doctrine forged through 3 years of combat across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Their primary interceptor remained the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, known to Allied intelligence as Oscar, and its successor, the Ki-84 Hayate, or Frank. These were formidable aircraft when engaging bombers at 15 to 20,000 feet, the altitude at which American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds typically operated over Europe. Japanese pilots had developed effective tactics against conventional bomber formations: approach from above when possible, target the engines or the cockpit, break away before the formation's defensive fire could concentrate. But the B-29 changed every variable in these established equations. Its service ceiling exceeded 35,000 feet. Its defensive armament included remotely controlled turrets with General Electric fire control systems that could track targets with a precision Japanese designers had not anticipated. Most critically, it carried up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, 3 times the typical payload of earlier American heavy bombers, from a distance that made the aircraft practically invulnerable to conventional air defense. The Japanese response to this new threat centered on the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, specifically the Model 52 variant that entered production in autumn 1943. The Zero had become legendary in the war's opening campaigns, and for good reason. In December 1941, and throughout 1942, it had achieved kill ratios that Allied intelligence initially refused to believe. Its exceptional range and maneuverability had given Japan air superiority across vast stretches of the Pacific. But the aircraft carried a fatal compromise built into its very structure. To achieve its legendary agility and range, Mitsubishi's designers had eliminated virtually all armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero weighed less than 6,000 pounds empty, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than its American contemporaries. This gave it extraordinary performance in turning combat at low to medium altitudes, but it also meant that a single, well-aimed burst from a .50 caliber machine gun could transform the aircraft into a flaming coffin. By late 1944, Japanese industrial capacity had deteriorated to the point where even maintaining current production levels demanded desperate improvisation. The precision, machine tools necessary for aircraft manufacturing were wearing out, and American submarine warfare had severed the supply lines, bringing essential materials from Southeast Asia. Aluminum supplies had become so critical that the government organized nationwide collection campaigns, asking citizens to donate anything made of the metal. Quality control in the factories suffered as experienced workers were drafted for combat duty and replaced with minimally trained laborers, often women and students. A Zero that rolled off the Mitsubishi production line in mid-1944 was measurably inferior to one produced in 1942, not because the design had changed, but because Japanese industry could no longer maintain the standards required to build it properly. The commanders responsible for defending Japan's home islands understood these material constraints intellectually, but the psychological adjustment proved more difficult. Japan's military culture emphasized spirit over material, the power of will over the limitations of equipment. This was not mere propaganda, though propaganda certainly reinforced it. Generations of officers had been educated in a tradition that valued moral qualities, courage, determination, loyalty, as decisive factors in warfare. The early war victories seemed to validate this worldview. Japanese forces had conquered territories defended by enemies with superior industrial resources, by fighting with greater intensity and tactical skill. The problem with this narrative became apparent only when the material disparity grew so vast that no amount of spiritual determination could bridge it. A Zero pilot, no matter how skilled or courageous, could not pursue a B-29 flying 3 miles above him. Willpower could not add 5,000 feet to his aircraft's service ceiling. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, who assumed command of Japanese Army Air Force operations in March 1945, inherited a defense system built on increasingly desperate mathematics. Japanese intelligence estimates suggested that the Americans might eventually base 200 B-29 seconds in the Marianas for operations against the home islands. These estimates were already obsolete when Kawabe received them. By February 1945, the actual number exceeded 500, and it was climbing toward 1,000. But even the lower estimates created an impossible defensive equation. If each B-29 raid consisted of 100 bombers, and if Japanese fighters could intercept even half of them, an optimistic assumption given the altitude challenges, and if Japanese pilots achieved a 10% kill rate per mission, far higher than actual combat results, the arithmetic still favored the Americans catastrophically. The United States could replace its losses. Japan could not. The Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino, photographed by that lone B-29 on November 1st, produced engines for the Zero among other aircraft types. It sprawled across nearly 2 million square feet, but its machine shops contained only a fraction of the backup equipment or dispersed production capacity that American factories took for granted. When B-29 seconds returned to bomb Musashino in earnest, beginning in late November, the attacks would not need to destroy the plant entirely to cripple production. Damaging key machine tools or disrupting the workflow between departments would suffice. The Japanese had concentrated their aircraft industry in a handful of large plants around Tokyo and Nagoya because dispersed production demanded a level of transportation infrastructure and component standardization that the economy could not support. This concentration, efficient in peacetime, created catastrophic vulnerability in war. The Americans understood this vulnerability with a clarity that bordered on mathematical precision. Their target selection process, refined through years of strategic bombing analysis, identified choke points in enemy production systems. The B-29 program itself represented a massive bet on strategic bombing theory, the belief that industrial warfare could be won by destroying an enemy's capacity to produce weapons rather than by defeating their armies in the field. Whether this theory was morally acceptable or militarily effective remains debated. But in late 1944, American planners had committed to it completely, and they possessed the industrial capacity to execute their plan on a scale unprecedented in military history. The Japanese Army Air Force had approximately 3,000 fighters available for homeland defense in November 1944. This sounds like a substantial force until one examines the distribution and readiness rates. Roughly half these aircraft were dispersed across China, Formosa, and Korea, positioned to defend against potential threats from those directions. Of the remaining 1,500 in the home islands, perhaps 1,000 were operational at any given time, accounting for maintenance, repairs, and pilot training requirements. Against a determined B-29 campaign flying from the Marianas, this force was inadequate by any reasonable calculation. What made the situation truly desperate was not the numbers alone, but the attrition rate. Every combat mission depleted irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Every training flight consumed fuel that could not be replaced. The Americans could afford to trade losses, the Japanese could not. In the operations rooms where Japanese commanders plotted their defensive strategies, maps showed the home islands surrounded by widening circles indicating B-29 range from various American bases. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas put Tokyo within easy reach. From these islands, the superfortresses could strike any target in Japan, conduct their missions, and return, all without pushing their fuel reserves to dangerous limits. Japanese planners had understood this geography when they fought desperately to hold the Marianas in summer 1944. The loss of those islands had created the strategic nightmare they now faced. But even understanding the geography could not change it. The circles on the map represented an inescapable reality. Japan's industrial heartland lay within range of an enemy who possessed the means to attack it systematically, day after day. until the defenders' capacity to resist simply ceased to exist. The confidence that General Hattori expressed in November, watching that first B-29 tracking across his plotting table, rested on assumptions about American industrial capacity and strategic patience that would prove comprehensively wrong. Japanese intelligence had estimated B-29 production at perhaps 10 to 15 aircraft per month, a rate that seemed consistent with the aircraft's complexity and cost. The actual rate in late 1944 exceeded 100 per month and was accelerating. American factories had overcome the B-29's notorious production challenges, its complex engine cooling systems, its pressurized cabin requirements, its sophisticated fire control mechanisms through brute force engineering and unlimited resources. They had built entire new manufacturing facilities, recruited and trained tens of thousands of specialized workers, and created supply chains that stretched across the continent. The Japanese had accomplished remarkable feats of production efficiency under brutal resource constraints, but they were competing against an economy that operated under fundamentally different rules. The winter of 1944 moved toward 1945 with a sense of gathering storm. In the Marianas, ground crews worked through tropical heat to service bombers that arrived weekly in growing numbers. In Japan, factory workers struggled to maintain production schedules despite deteriorating equipment and shrinking material supplies. And in the fighter squadrons stationed around Tokyo and Nagoya, pilots trained for missions they increasingly understood to be suicidal. The B-29 flew too high, too fast, and too well defended for conventional intercept tactics to work reliably. Killing one might cost 3 or 4 defending fighters, and Japan did not have 3 or 4 fighters to trade for every bomber the Americans sent. But orders were orders, doctrine was doctrine, and when the bombers came in force, the Zeros would rise to meet them, climbing desperately toward an enemy that seemed to exist in a different element of the sky altogether. The laughter that Japanese commanders supposedly expressed when first hearing about the B-29 program, if it ever occurred, would have been the bitter laughter of men who understood their situation perfectly, but could not acknowledge it openly. They knew what was coming. Their intelligence services had provided adequate warning. Their own industrial analysts had calculated the impossible mathematics of the coming air campaign. But military culture, national pride, and the simple momentum of war made honest assessment impossible. So they prepared their defenses, allocated their inadequate resources as efficiently as possible, and waited for the Americans to reveal just how vast the material disparity had become. The first large-scale B-29 raid against Tokyo occurred on November 24, 1944. 111 superfortresses launched from the Marianas, and 88 reached the target area through weather that should have turned back a less determined force. They bombed from above 27,000 feet, releasing their payloads through clouds that obscured both the target and the defensive response. Japanese fighters rose to intercept but struggled to reach bombing altitude before the Americans completed their runs. The raid damaged portions of the Nakajima Musashino plant, though less severely than planners had hoped. But the raid's significance lay not in the physical damage, but in what it demonstrated. The Americans could now strike Tokyo with forces large enough to overwhelm Japanese defenses, and they could do so repeatedly, limited only by weather and their own logistical capacity. In the weeks that followed, the pattern established itself with crushing regularity. B-29 seconds appeared over Japanese cities every few days, sometimes in groups exceeding 100 aircraft, targeting aircraft factories, engine plants, and industrial facilities. Japanese fighters intercepted when conditions allowed, occasionally shooting down a bomber, more often simply harassing the formations without decisive effect. The altitude advantage alone made interception problematic, but the B-29's defensive armament proved even more deadly than intelligence estimates had suggested. The remotely controlled turrets could engage fighters from multiple angles simultaneously, creating fields of fire that conventional gun positions could never match. A Zero attacking from the classic 12 o'clock high position diving from above and ahead found itself under fire not from a single gunner with limited traverse, but from multiple turrets tracking its approach with mechanical precision. The 90 days that followed November 24th saw Japanese fighter strength in the home islands enter a death spiral from which it would never recover. Every major raid cost defenders, aircraft and pilots. Training new pilots required fuel that grew scarcer by the week. Replacing destroyed fighters demanded factory output that American bombing steadily reduced. The mathematics compounded. Fewer fighters meant less effective interceptions, which meant more bombers reached their targets, which meant more damage to aircraft factories, which meant fewer replacement fighters. By late February 1945, Japanese Army Air Force commanders faced a reality that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. They were running out of fighters not because of battlefield losses, though those were severe, but because their capacity to produce replacements had been systematically destroyed by the very threat they were trying to defend against. The strategic bombing campaign that unfolded over Japan between November 1944 and February 1945 operated according to principles that had been refined through years of aerial warfare over Europe, but the Pacific theater presented unique challenges that forced American planners to adapt their methods. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, who commanded the 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas during these initial months, believed firmly in precision daylight bombing of industrial targets. His approach mirrored the doctrine that the 8th Air Force had employed over Germany: identify critical production facilities, attack them systematically until they ceased functioning, and thereby cripple the enemy's capacity to wage war. The theory was sound, and it had achieved measurable results in Europe. But Japan presented variables that Hansell's doctrine struggled to accommodate. The jet stream over Japan created meteorological conditions unlike anything American bomber crews had encountered in Europe. These high-altitude winds, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, made accurate bombing from 30,000 feet nearly impossible. Bombardiers watching their targets through northern bomb sites found their calculations rendered meaningless by wind speeds that could push bombs miles off target, even with perfect aim. The winter weather added another layer of difficulty. Cloud cover obscured targets on more than half the scheduled raid dates. When bombers did reach their targets, the clouds often prevented visual confirmation of bomb impacts, making damage assessment impossible and forcing commanders to order return missions against facilities that might already be destroyed. The fighter opposition, while less intense than what American bombers faced over Germany, proved more unpredictable and occasionally more desperate. Japanese pilots, facing an enemy they could barely reach, began experimenting with tactics that ranged from innovative to suicidal. Some fighter groups modified their Zeros by stripping away all non-essential equipment, radios, armor that had been added to later models, even some ammunition to gain altitude performance. These modified aircraft could reach 28 or 29,000 feet, still below the B-29's bombing altitude, but close enough to make diving attacks possible. The problem was that planes stripped of this drastically became even more vulnerable than standard Zeros. A few hits anywhere on the aircraft could prove catastrophic. Colonel Takeo Doi, commanding the 53rd Fighter Regiment stationed at Kisarazu Airfield east of Tokyo, implemented tactics in December 1944 that his pilots described as aggressive but realistic. Rather than attempting to intercept B-29 formations, at bombing altitude, Doi's fighters would position themselves above the likely withdrawal routes and wait for damaged bombers to descend. Wounded B-29 seconds, struggling with failed engines or battle damage, often could not maintain altitude. As they descended, they entered the envelope where Japanese fighters could engage effectively. This approach yielded some successes. Doi's regiment claimed 12 B-29 seconds destroyed between December 1st and December 31st. But it also revealed the fundamental problem Japanese defenders faced. Even when tactics worked, even when conditions favored the interceptors, the exchange rate remained unsustainable. The Nakajima factories around Tokyo became focal points of the American campaign, and watching these facilities slowly disintegrate under repeated bombing provided Japanese commanders with a real-time demonstration of strategic air power's cumulative effects. The Musashino plant, which had produced engines for Zeros and other fighters, suffered its first significant damage on December 3rd, when B-29 seconds destroyed approximately 40% of the facility's roof coverage and damaged several machine tool installations. The plant continued operating, with workers repairing damage between raids and shifting production to undamaged buildings. But on December 27th, another raid collapsed portions of two main assembly halls and destroyed machine tools that could not be replaced. By early January, Musashino's output had dropped to roughly 30% of its pre-bombing capacity. What made this loss particularly devastating was not simply the reduction in engine production, but the ripple effects throughout Japan's aircraft manufacturing system. Other factories depended on Musashino for specific engine components that they could not produce themselves. When Musashino's output dropped, final assembly plants in Nagoya and elsewhere found themselves with incomplete aircraft, waiting for parts that would never arrive. The Japanese industrial system, already stretched impossibly thin, lacked the redundancy to route around damaged facilities. American factories, by contrast, had been designed from the start with redundancy built in. If a plant in Michigan suffered damage, production could shift to facilities in California or Georgia. Japan had no such flexibility. The human cost of these raids extended far beyond the bomber crews and fighter pilots directly involved in combat. Workers at the targeted factories endured conditions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. After each raid, they returned to damaged facilities to clear rubble, repair machinery, and resume production under roofs that might be partially collapsed or missing entirely. Many factories operated without adequate lighting after bombing damaged electrical systems, forcing workers to perform precision assembly tasks by firelight or daylight filtering through damaged roofs. The government had mobilized students and elderly workers to replace men drafted into military service, and these inexperienced workers struggled with tasks that required skills developed over years of practice. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with over 60 confirmed aerial victories, returned to combat duty in February 1945 after recovering from wounds received earlier in the war. In post-war interviews, he described the defensive situation over Tokyo as fundamentally impossible. The B-29 seconds flew higher than most fighters could reach, in formations so large that intercepting them all was impossible, even if every available fighter launched. More critically, Sakai observed that the psychological impact on less experienced pilots was devastating. Young pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours of flight training, found themselves ordered to attack bomber formations that bristled with defensive armament. The B-29's tail gunner position alone mounted two 50 caliber machine guns with firing arcs that covered the most common approach angles for interceptors. A pilot attempting a stern attack faced concentrated fire that could shred his aircraft before he closed to effective gun range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transition from conventional high-altitude bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks, which would culminate in the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, represented a fundamental shift in American strategy. But that shift was already becoming apparent in early 1945, as commanders recognized the limitations of precision bombing under Japanese weather conditions. Major General Curtis LeMay, who replaced Hansel in January, began planning raids that would fly at lower altitudes, where accuracy improved but vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire increased. The Japanese defensive response would need to adapt to this new approach, but adaptation required resources, fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft, trained pilots that no longer existed in adequate quantities. The statistical records, maintained by Japanese Army Air Force headquarters, tell a story more clearly than any narrative description could capture. In November 1944, the Home Defense Forces possessed approximately 1,400 operational fighters. By January 1, 1945, that number had dropped to roughly 1,100. By February 1, it stood at approximately 900. These figures represented not just combat losses but also mechanical attrition, aircraft damaged beyond repair given available spare parts, engines that failed due to poor quality fuel or inadequate maintenance, landing accidents caused by inexperienced pilots operating from damaged airfields. The Americans were destroying Japanese fighter strength, not primarily through air-to-air combat, but by systematically eliminating the industrial and logistical systems that kept fighters flying. The fuel situation grew critical faster than most observers expected. Japan's synthetic fuel production, never adequate to meet military demands, depended on facilities that American planners identified as priority targets. By February 1945, aviation fuel supplies had dropped to the point where training flights were severely restricted. New pilots received minimal flight time before being assigned to operational units, sometimes as few as 50 hours total flying time. By comparison, American pilots typically completed 200 to 300 hours of training before assignment to combat units. The experience gap manifested in combat with brutal clarity. Veteran Japanese pilots, the survivors of 3 years of warfare, could still pose serious threats to American bombers. But these veterans were dying or being pulled back to training roles where their experience might preserve some institutional knowledge. The pilots replacing them lacked the skills to survive their first engagements, let alone achieve victories. Major Yoshio Yoshida, who flew Ki-84 fighters with the 47th Fighter Regiment defending Nagoya, kept a diary that was recovered after the war. His entries from January and February 1945 describe a steady disintegration of unit cohesion and capability. On January 7th, he noted that his squadron had lost 3 pilots in a single engagement with B-29 seconds, with no confirmed kills in return. On January 23rd, he recorded that replacement pilots arrived with such limited training that they could barely execute formation flying, let alone combat maneuvers. On February 10th, he wrote that fuel supplies had been cut to the point where each pilot received only enough for 1 training flight per week. His final entry, dated February 27th, described watching a formation of over 100 B-29 seconds bombing Nagoya, while his squadron remained grounded due to fuel shortages. The bombers faced no fighter opposition that day. The strategic calculus that Japanese commanders confronted by late February bordered on the absurd. They possessed, on paper, sufficient fighters to mount meaningful opposition to American raids. But those fighters could not fly without fuel, could not be repaired without spare parts, could not be replaced when destroyed because the factories producing them were themselves being destroyed. The pilots needed to fly those fighters required training that consumed fuel they did not have, and even with training, they were being asked to engage an enemy operating with technological and material advantages so vast that victory required not just skill, but miraculous luck. The defensive system was not losing. It had already lost. What remained was the mechanical process of that defeat playing out across the skies of Japan, one unequal engagement at a time. The B-29 losses during this period, while significant in absolute numbers, remained well within acceptable limits by American standards. Between November 1944 and the end of February 1945, the 20th Air Force lost approximately 75 B-29 seconds to all causes over Japan combat action, mechanical failure, weather, and accidents. Each lost bomber represented 10 crew members killed or captured, and each loss was mourned. But American industry was producing B-29 seconds faster than the Japanese could destroy them. In January 1945 alone, Boeing and its subcontractors delivered 142 new B-29 seconds to the Army Air Forces. The Japanese destroyed perhaps 15 that month over the home islands. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. The psychological impact of this imbalance extended beyond the pilots and crews directly engaged in combat. Japanese civilians, watching contrails at altitudes they had never imagined aircraft could reach, began to understand that their homeland was no longer safe from attack. The propaganda that had sustained morale through the war's early years, stories of invincible Japanese pilots and miraculous victories rang increasingly hollow as American bombers appeared over major cities with growing frequency and seeming impunity. The government attempted to maintain public morale through radio broadcasts, emphasizing Japanese spiritual strength and predictions of ultimate victory, but these messages competed with the evidence of people's own eyes. When citizens could watch dozens of enemy bombers flying overhead in daylight, in formation, apparently unchallenged by friendly fighters, propaganda could not erase the implications. The industrial workforce, particularly the men and women laboring in aircraft factories, understood the situation with special clarity. They could see production dropping week by week as materials grew scarce and equipment failed. They experienced air raids firsthand, huddling in inadequate shelters while bombs fell on their workplaces. They watched colleagues die or suffer injuries from collapsing buildings and fires. And they understood, even if they could not speak openly about it, that they were losing a war of production that had been decided before it truly began. Japan's industrial economy, impressive by Asian standards in 1941, had never possessed the capacity to wage sustained industrial warfare against the United States. The gap was not one of efficiency or dedication, but of fundamental resources: steel production, electrical generation capacity, machine tool availability, petroleum supplies, transportation infrastructure. The Americans possessed all these in quantities that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. By the end of February 1945, the defensive situation over Japan had deteriorated to the point where several senior commanders privately acknowledged that conventional fighter tactics could no longer prevent American bombers from striking any target they chose. This realization led to discussions of more extreme measures, tactics that moved beyond conventional military engagement into the realm of deliberate self-sacrifice. The special attack, or kamikaze tactics that had emerged in the Philippines in October 1944 as a naval aviation response to overwhelming American carrier forces, now began appearing in plans for homeland defense. If conventional attacks could not stop B-29 seconds, perhaps deliberate ramming attacks might achieve better results. The logic was desperate but not entirely irrational. A fighter crashing into a bomber would almost certainly destroy both aircraft, and Japan had fighters it could no longer fuel or pilot effectively anyway. Converting them into single-use weapons offered a way to exact some cost from the enemy, even as the defensive system collapsed. The first documented deliberate ramming attack against a B-29 over Japan occurred on January 27, 1945, when Captain Teruo Yamaguchi of the 10th Fighter Regiment dove his Ki-84 into the wing of a Superfortress during a raid on Kawasaki. The bomber exploded, killing all crew members. Yamaguchi did not survive. His action was recorded as heroic in Japanese military reports, and other pilots were encouraged to emulate his sacrifice when circumstances permitted. What those reports did not acknowledge was the fundamental desperation this tactic represented. An air force resorting to deliberate collision attacks was an air force that had exhausted conventional options. The 90-day period from late November to late February represented not just military defeat, but the visible collapse of strategic assumptions that had sustained Japanese war planning. In November, commanders could still believe that American bombing might be contained, that fighter defenses might impose prohibitive costs on attackers, that Japanese industry might continue producing sufficient aircraft to maintain resistance. By February, all these assumptions had been comprehensively disproved. The Americans had not been contained. Their losses remained acceptable. Japanese industrial capacity was not maintaining resistance, it was actively disintegrating under systematic attack. The actual number of Japanese fighters lost during this period remains disputed in historical records, with different sources providing different figures depending on how they categorize losses. Combat losses, mechanical failures, training accidents, and aircraft destroyed on the ground all contributed to the attrition, and Japanese record-keeping deteriorated as the military situation worsened. Conservative estimates place total Japanese Army Air Force fighter losses in the home islands during November 1944 through February 1945 at approximately 500 aircraft. More aggressive estimates, accounting for aircraft damaged beyond economic repair and those lost in non-combat accidents caused by inadequate training and fuel quality issues, exceed 700 aircraft. The exact figure matters less than the trajectory. Japanese fighter strength in the home islands declined by more than a third in 3 months, and that decline was accelerating. The implications of this attrition extended beyond the immediate defensive situation. Every experienced pilot lost represented knowledge that could not be replaced. Japanese military aviation, like military aviation everywhere, depended on institutional knowledge passed from experienced pilots to novices through training and example. When veterans died faster than they could train replacements, that knowledge disappeared. By March 1945, Japanese fighter units contained large numbers of pilots who had never fired their guns in combat, had never flown in formation under enemy fire, had never executed the complex maneuvers required to attack a bomber formation effectively. They were, in effect, sacrificing themselves not in pursuit of victory, but simply to maintain the appearance of resistance. The B-29 campaign's effectiveness derived not from any single element, but from the systematic integration of multiple advantages: technological, industrial, logistical, and tactical. The aircraft itself represented the technological edge: long range, high altitude, heavy payload, sophisticated defensive armament. American industrial capacity provided numerical superiority that could absorb losses. Japanese forces could not inflict frequently enough to matter. The logistics chain stretching from factories in Kansas and Washington state to air bases in the Marianas demonstrated organizational capabilities that Japan could not match. And the tactical flexibility to adapt approaches from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks showed an institutional agility that Japanese defensive planning could not counter. The human experiences embedded in these strategic realities deserve recognition even when the strategic outcome was inevitable. Japanese pilots climbed into their fighters, knowing the odds were catastrophically against them, and flew anyway, not because they were fanatics immune to fear, but because military culture, national loyalty, and the simple momentum of war left them no alternative they could accept. American bomber crews, flying missions that lasted 15 hours or more over hostile territory, experienced their own terror and losses, and their victories came at a cost measured in friends killed or captured. War's fundamental tragedy lies not in strategic abstraction, but in the human cost of decisions made by people who often understood they were choosing badly, because all alternatives seemed worse. By early March 1945, when Major General LeMay ordered the shift to low-altitude incendiary raids that would devastate Tokyo and other Japanese cities, the defensive situation had deteriorated to the point where Japanese fighters posed minimal threat to American bombers under any tactical approach. The March 9th raid on Tokyo, 325 B-29 seconds flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, dropping incendiaries that created a firestorm, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians, encountered fighter opposition so limited that most bomber crews never saw a Japanese aircraft. The fighters were grounded, lacking fuel or destroyed on their airfields, or simply too few to matter against formations of such size. The laughter attributed to Japanese commanders when they first learned of the B-29, whether actual or apocryphal, represented the last moment when Japanese military leadership could entertain any confidence that their defensive systems might contain American strategic bombing. That confidence died quickly, killed by mathematics as brutal as any combat engagement. 500 zeros, or 700, or whatever the actual number lost in 90 days, not primarily through dramatic aerial combat, but through the systematic destruction of the industrial and logistical systems that kept them flying. The B-29 campaign against Japan in late 1944 and early 1945 demonstrated strategic air power's potential to dismantle an enemy's capacity for resistance without needing to defeat their armies in the field. Whether this demonstration justified the means employed, particularly the incendiary raids that followed, remains contested. But the effectiveness of the approach was never in doubt. Lieutenant General Kawabe, surveying defensive preparations in March 1945, understood that he commanded forces that existed more on paper than in operational reality. The fighter squadrons defending Japan retained their unit designations and maintained their bases, but their combat power had been hollowed out by 3 months of unsustainable attrition. The industrial facilities they were supposed to protect were already damaged beyond quick repair. The logistics network, supporting both defense and production, was collapsing under combined pressure of material shortages and direct bombing. The strategic situation admitted no solution that existing resources could implement. The lesson that emerged from these 90 days would shape strategic thinking about air power for decades after the war ended. A determined industrial power, willing to commit resources on a massive scale, could use strategic bombing to systematically dismantle an enemy's capacity for resistance. The approach required patience, accepting that individual raids might accomplish little, while the cumulative effect over weeks and months proved decisive. It required industrial capacity sufficient to absorb losses while maintaining pressure. It required technological advantages that made interception difficult and costly for defenders. The United States in 1945 possessed all these elements. Japan possessed none of them. The outcome was never in doubt once the strategic bombing campaign began in earnest. For the Japanese pilots who survived this period, the experience left psychological scars as deep as any physical wounds. They had fought with courage and skill, often against impossible odds, and watched their efforts prove meaningless against an enemy who could simply outlast and outproduce them. Post-war interviews with surviving pilots reveal a common theme: not regret for fighting, but anger at leadership that had committed Japan to a war the nation could not win, then sustained that war long after its inevitable conclusion became apparent. The fighters burning on Japanese airfields and in Japanese skies during those 90 days represented not just machines destroyed, but illusions shattered. The illusion that Japan could compete industrially with the United States, the illusion that spiritual strength could overcome material disparity, the illusion that the war might end in anything but total defeat. The final irony of the B-29 campaign over Japan in these crucial months was that its most devastating effects came not from the bombs it dropped, but from the resources Japan expended trying to defend against it. The fuel burned by fighters attempting intercepts, the industrial capacity diverted to fighter production, the experienced pilots lost in unwinnable engagements, all these represented resources that might have been used elsewhere, perhaps extending Japan's capacity for resistance in other theaters. Instead, they were consumed in a defensive effort that was doomed from the start by simple mathematics. The Americans could send more bombers than Japan could intercept, and they could do so indefinitely. No defensive tactic, no matter how innovative or courageously executed, could change that fundamental reality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.